Government Scientific Advisory Committee examining radiation risks from internal emitters. We're grateful to have their time, their expertise, and we're here today because we believe it's crucial to inform the public about the dangers of a nuclear winter and to emphasize that there are dedicated professionals like our guests who have spent their lives working tirelessly to fight for your safety through their research and outreach efforts. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Dorfman.
Hello, and I in turn, of course, would like to introduce the key reason why we're here, Professor Brian Toon. Professor Toon is Professor Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Studies and Research Scientist, Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, University of Colorado. It's very important to note that his research on asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs led to the groundbreaking discovery of nuclear winter. He's developed key work on how aerosols behave in the atmosphere and impact climate, and how the use of nuclear weapons threatens global civilization. Amongst many other accolades and awards, Professor Toon is elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has been given Future of Life Award from the Future of Life Institute, and the Award for Global Peace and Health by International Physics for the Prevention of Nuclear War in recognition of his landmark research on nuclear winter and nuclear famine. So without more ado, I give you, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Brian Toon.
Thank you. So I'm sure that our audience is familiar with the recent threats to use nuclear weapons, so that this is a topic that faded away from people's attention largely following the end of the Cold War. But unfortunately, we're back having to confront this possibility. So I'd like to take about 20 minutes in this meeting here to give you a little background information so that we can have a nice conversation about this problem after that. So I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will work. Okay, get that off there. So it always wants to put stuff you don't want up there. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the environmental risks of nuclear war. So there's the risk of having an explosion in a city that you're living in, which is a different issue, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. So this graph is a history of nuclear warheads on the planet. And so this axis, vertical axis here, is the number of weapons. And this is the time since the Second World War, going up to a few years ago. And so what I wanted to talk about here is this peak value here. So in about 1986, there were more than 60,000 nuclear warheads on the planet, 60,000. There are only 500 cities in Russia and the United States total, with more than 100,000 people in them. 60,000 weapons, that's more than 100 nuclear weapons for every city and town with more than 100,000 people in it. This is obviously absurd. It only takes one nuclear weapon to blow up a small city, which we already know because of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So having a bloated arsenal of 60,000 nuclear weapons was obviously out of control. And at the time, the populace of the world was aware of this. They knew how many nuclear weapons were there. And in the early 1980s, there were all kinds of demonstrations against having so many nuclear weapons. And at that time, nuclear winter, which I'm talking to you about today, was discovered. And something happened here in 1986 that led to the build down of these weapons. And it was not the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which happened in about 1992 over here somewhere. So what did happen, which we can learn from comments made by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, who were the ones who solved the problem, is that they heard about this nuclear winter. And Ronald Reagan gave talks to the press and said, well, I know about the year without a summer in 1816, where a volcano put a lot of stuff in the stratosphere and people had trouble growing their crops. And that could happen after a nuclear war. And Mikhail Gorbachev said, Russian and American scientists are telling us that all these nuclear weapons could end civilization as we know it. And this is people of morality and have to act in this situation. And so Reagan and Gorbachev did act, and they started to remove nuclear weapons from Europe. And you can see that every American president since then, and every Russian leader since then, has reduced nuclear weapons. And this has continued up until the last few years, when the Trump administration and the Putin administration decided to abrogate the treaty that led to the decline of these weapons. And we have one treaty that's sort of left in place that Putin has said he's going to walk away from. So I think an important point from this graph is we can reduce nuclear weapons, and politicians will respond to the public and to the science community if people tell them that there's a problem they should deal with. So let's talk about what's here now. So this graph shows you the number of warheads on this axis here and the various countries that have nuclear weapons. So you can see there are a number of nuclear states over here with small numbers of nuclear weapons. Well, this is not really a small number of nuclear weapons. As I mentioned, there's really only 200 cities in Russia with more than 100,000 people. So France and the United Kingdom could basically bomb every city in Russia if they wanted to. The United States has 300 cities. China could bomb every city in the United States if it doesn't have the systems to deploy the weapons there, but it could build them. And then you have India and Pakistan. Pakistan has like 60 cities, many more than India. India has many more weapons than are needed to bomb all the cities in Pakistan. So these are not inconsequential arsenals over here. There's about 1,000 weapons altogether in these countries. But more than 90% of the weapons are in Russia and the United States. And these bars represent how the weapons are controlled by treaties. So down here are these red bars, which represent about 2,000 weapons in Russia and the United States each, are the deployed strategic warheads. So they're on ICBMs or submarines or bombers, and they're deployed, can easily be used quickly. Then there's another 2,000 weapons in each country. So now we're up to about 4,000 each that are in storage or stockpiled. So these could be brought out in case of a war, although it'd probably be difficult to do that without making the other country very worried. And then there are quite a few weapons here that are stockpiled to be dismantled. So the basic point here is that there are about 4,000 weapons that are sitting here ready to be deployed instantaneously. There's only 500 cities to attack. So that means there are 8 weapons still left to attack every city with more than 100,000 people. In addition to that, Russia has about 2,000 tactical weapons. There's a lot of confusion about tactical weapons in the press. So tactical weapons merely means that the weapon is used for fighting in a battlefield. It's not on an ICBM or a submarine or something like that. But it means nothing about the yield of the tactical weapon. It could be just as big as a strategic weapon. The average strategic weapon has a yield of about 250 kilotons. The United States tested tactical weapons as artillery shells that had yields of about 15 kilotons, which is the size of the Hiroshima bomb. So you can imagine an artillery cannon with a bunch of nuclear weapons sitting next to it, each capable of destroying a city, being fired on Europe. That's what these weapons are for, mostly is to be used against Europe. And they're on cruise missiles, they're on short-range normal missiles, they're on ships, They're on aircraft. And they're not controlled by treaty. We know very little about them. So this is very concerning that there are so many of these weapons still around. What are the targets? So this is a controversial thing as to whether or not the military targets cities or it only targets military bases. And it's, of course, illegal to target cities, but that's how the Second World War was won. In Japan, for example, at the end of the war, more than 60 Japanese cities were burned to the ground by carpet bombing them with incendiary weapons. And of course, then there was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's unclear whether either country would attack cities just because they're cities. There are also military targets, but military targets are often located next to cities. Plus, a lot of military targets are things like large commercial airfields, oil refineries, power plants, universities and government laboratories that are doing essential research and things like that. So the military targets are co-located with cities anyway. So cities will certainly be bombed. In this map of the United States, there's about 1,200 military targets that I have found using military bases and the other targets I just mentioned. Nobody knows what the real targets are. They're highly classified. But in this map, there are at least 2 nuclear weapons targeted in every state in the United States. Some of them are things like state capitals in the U.S. Capitol, because those would be seen as places where the military might take orders from. Likewise, well, here's just an example where we actually look at the size of the destruction area. So I chose San Diego here to look at. You can see the harbor area here. And on the left are circles that represent the damage that would be done from blast waves. And so this little interior circle here is where concrete reinforced buildings would be destroyed. And the outer circle is where brick buildings and houses like people often live in would be destroyed. So the military only pays attention to what's called assured destruction from blast waves because they know that's going to happen. You can see San Diego has a lot of military targets in it, so the whole area is pretty much covered. But this is actually tremendously underestimates the damage that's likely to occur. So this area over here is the fire ignition area. So these are the same targets, but you can see they're much larger because when a nuclear weapon explodes, it puts out a bright burst of light, which can ignite easily ignitable things like newspapers and tree leaves and limbs of trees and things like that. And we know that these fires will occur. Hiroshima and Nagasaki both had firestorms or intense fires because of those nuclear weapons blowing up. But the military wants to ignore that because it isn't sure if it's blowing something up where there's fuel. And there were more than 500 above ground nuclear weapons tests. They didn't start big fires because they were in deserts or on islands because they didn't want to start fires they couldn't control. The areas of these are quite substantial. If you have a weapon that's like 200 kilotons, the area that's burned in these fires is going to be approaching 200 square kilometers, a very large area. So here's some European targets. You can see there's many European military targets for the tactical weapons, and there's also these Russian military targets that I've identified here. So there are a lot of targets over the world. So what do we see when a nuclear weapon goes off? We know this from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this building was part of an international exposition before the war. The bomb fell almost on top of this building. This was a small weapon, like an artillery shell, as I mentioned, has been tested. And you can see all this rubbleized area out here and some concrete buildings standing in the distance. So you might think that this is the area that blew down from the blast wave, but it isn't. This is the area that burned. So this is all a region that's been burned by a firestorm and destroyed by the fire. And so you get intense fires started by these nuclear weapons going off. And this is an example taken a few hours after the Hiroshima explosion of the smoke from the firestorm. A lot of people have confused this with the fireball from the bomb, but that's not what this is. This is smoke from the fire. And this big cloud, which is called a pyrocumulus, we sometimes see these now after big natural fires in forested areas. This pyrocumulus, for a colored picture you'd see, was full of smoke. And the top of this cloud is about 16 kilometers. It's far above the ground. And the reason this matters is if you have a fire in a forest or something like that, which we're used to, they're not very big fires, and the smoke is put into the region within a few kilometers of the ground where it rains a lot. And so the smoke, it rains out within a few days and doesn't persist. But if you start to put smoke up here into the stratosphere, which is where this cloud is topping out, it never rains in the stratosphere. And so that smoke will stay there for years. This is a big problem. Okay, so if you put smoke into the stratosphere, it absorbs sunlight, which I don't have time to really discuss here, but it gets so hot in the stratosphere that it basically destroys the ozone layer, which would threaten us at the surface with ultraviolet light. The other thing, though, that happens is if you stop the sunlight in the stratosphere, it doesn't get to the ground anymore. And so this is a calculation of how much light on a global average would get to the surface for various wars. So these wars in here are all based on India and Pakistan. So India and Pakistan are rapidly increasing their arsenals, which is why we have gone up from this blue curve in the last decade. And so these are the possible levels of smoke now. And so this thing, teragram, is 1 million tons. So that's the amount of smoke being put into the stratosphere by this war. And so the uncertainty here with India and Pakistan is we don't know what the yield of their weapons is. If they're like the Hiroshima bomb, then you end up with this light blue color. But if they're more like the average weapons, 100 kilotons or something like that, the smallest weapons that Russia and the US use, they'd probably be more like this orange curve here, and we might have 37 million tons of smoke. So what does this mean? So if we take this example here from this orange curve, you'd lose about 30% of the sunlight at the surface. This is years down here. You'd lose 30% of the sunlight at the surface for like 3 years. If you had a war between the United States and NATO and Russia, you would probably lose more than 60% of your sunlight at the surface for more than 3 years. Okay, so this is not something that's difficult to understand in a climate model. This happens every night. The sun goes down, it gets dark, it starts to get cold. It happens every year in the winter. In the winter, there's less sunlight in the winter hemisphere. It gets cold and it gets snowy. And so there's nothing mysterious about the physics going on here. So this is what happens to the global temperature when you have these kinds of conflicts. So this on the right is a temperature change globally over a time scale of years. So this is a US-Russia war. The temperature drops by 10 degrees centigrade on a global average. This is a war between India and Pakistan with modern weapons. It's 5 degrees centigrade. This is a typical temperature in the last ice age. We're talking about creating ice age temperatures on the planet that persist for periods of time like 6 years. It takes fully a decade for you to begin to recover, and you're not even fully recovered after a decade. And of course, it's not only the temperature change, less sunlight, there's less evaporation of water, and precipitation falls. So you've lost 30% of the precipitation for this war between India and Pakistan. And here you've lost about 60% of the precipitation. So let's take an example in a specific place. So this is the temperature difference from normal over a couple year time frame. So we can, this is for Iowa, which is a big grain producing area in the United States, and the Ukraine, which is a huge grain growing area in Europe and in Russia, or in that area. And you see the Ukrainian grain is so important to the world that even in their war, the Russians are allowing it to be exported so people don't starve in North Africa. In a normal year, the temperature is cold in the winter. In the summer, it gets warm. We're up to 20 degrees centigrade or so in here, in 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's cold again in the winter, warm again in the summer, cold again in the winter. So in this imaginary war here, which is marked by the black dashed curve, the temperature immediately starts dropping. And by the end of the summer, it's reached the freezing point for the daily minimum temperature. Warmer in the daytime maybe, but the daily minimum temperature is hitting freezing. And it stays below freezing all the way to the next summer. And it stays below freezing all through the next winter and barely starts to get above freezing 2 years after the start of this war. You're not going to grow anything if the temperatures are freezing every day. It will kill all the crops. So this is what this is going to look like. This is what a nuclear winter is going to look like a year or two after the war. You're going to have solitary individuals here wandering through a snow-covered landscape, approaching abandoned buildings that people have left. So we also have, in addition to using climate models to understand this, we've had to use agricultural models. So what we've done is to evaluate the agricultural response in every country in the world, with a few exceptions, to a war between India and Pakistan, and to a war between the United States, Russia, and NATO. So this is an example for an India-Pakistan war involving 100 kiloton weapons with a number of weapons that they currently possess. They currently have enough weapons to do this, but we don't know their yield for sure. There's a bunch of assumptions you have to make here. So we assume that people are only going to keep half their livestock and they'll eat the other half of the food they would have previously fed to the livestock. We assume that countries are not going to send food to anybody else. They're going to hoard it for themselves. And the most extreme assumption that we're making here is that we're only going to give food to the people, to enough people so they could barely survive, and everybody else gets no food. That's not going to happen. Those people are getting no food are going to attack the people that have food. So this is a conservative case in some respects. At any rate, what you see here is that in Canada, 95% of the population starves to death by the second year. In Russia, more than 75% of the population has starved to death by the second year. In the United States, 25 to 50% of the population starved to death. Here in Northern Europe, 95% of the population is starved to death. There are places which are not so bad, in South America mostly, where only a few percent of people may have starved. Altogether, though, we think a war between India and Pakistan would kill between 1 and 3 billion people. 1 and 3 billion people. This is Indian and Pakistani generals deciding they're mad at each other, fighting a war, using their arsenals, killing 1 to 3 billion people over the planet. We calculate that the direct fatalities in India and Pakistan are between 50 and 150 million people from just the explosions, but 10 times that many people would die worldwide who had nothing to do with this war. And of course, it's even worse in a war between the United States, NATO, and Russia. So here you see that Russia, China, most of Europe, the United States, and Canada, they're all losing 95% or more of their population. There's only a few percent of the population left in China and Russia in the second year. And as I showed you before, that's not when the climate change ends. It still goes on for another couple of years before there's any hope of any agriculture going on. So this is basically the entire northern hemisphere population is eliminated. There are still places in the southern hemisphere where it isn't quite so bad. Down here in Argentina, for example, there aren't too many deaths. In here, Australia and New Zealand. So the reasons that these countries survive are complicated. For example, in New Zealand, most of the product of New Zealand is sheep, which eat grass, and they export a lot of the sheep. And so after a war, instead of exporting the sheep, they could just eat the sheep. And so they would have enough food from the sheep to survive. Iceland is somewhat similar. It grows a lot of food that it exports, but it also eats a lot of fish. Probably not, they wouldn't survive there because there's actually a big ice buildup on the coast of Iceland. They wouldn't be able to get out to catch the fish. So this is probably not actually a good place to go, to Iceland. Okay, so what should we do about this? In the late 1970s, Congress required the Department of Defense to report to the American people what would happen if there were a nuclear war. The Department of Defense has not reported to you about this in 40-something years. They have told you nothing about what would happen to you in a nuclear war. You have no information about this. Either they don't want you to know, or they're not thinking about it, one or the other. This is not acceptable in the current war, in the current world. The population deserves to know what would happen if we did have a nuclear war. So you should ask your congressional representatives to require the military to make a report to the people on what would happen if there were a nuclear war. You deserve to know this. And I should point out that probably having the military report to this in the 1980s is one reason that people objected to it and controlled the number of weapons that were being made. You know, 70,000 weapons is obscene. 4,000 weapons, 8 in each city with 100,000 people in it, is still obscene. The second thing you can do is to learn about the rapid buildup of new nuclear weapons and delivery systems, and even more horrible systems that are being built. Right now, there are 50 nuclear missiles, armed missiles, sitting 50 miles to the north of me in northern Colorado. There's about 450 scattered over Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, and a little bit in Nebraska. Those things would be lost if there were a first strike and they weren't launched within 20 minutes of an attack by Russia. So the American president has 20 minutes to decide what to do. I know some political people like to think of Sleepy Joe Biden. So let's imagine it's the middle of the night here. It's the middle of the day in Russia. They launched their missiles. Jill Biden has to run down the hallway, wake up Joe. So wake up Joe, you have 20 minutes to decide whether you should end Western civilization, or you should assume that it's a false report that there's a missile attack. That's what we're facing right now. The president can launch our missiles on his own authority without anyone else stopping him. Russia in particular, but also the United States, are building new weapon systems designed to reduce the warning time. Hypersonic missiles, which Russia has used against Ukraine already recently, which the Ukrainians couldn't even shoot down because they fly so fast, are being developed in both countries. Russia now has torpedoes that can float into cities wherever it wishes with huge bombs on them. And destroy these cities probably with no warning. What are we going to do if we have all these systems floating around with no warning? Some military planner is going to turn this over to artificial intelligence. I don't know about you, but I have an Apple computer. Millions of people use this computer and the software. Mine messes up all the time. I can hardly even give you a talk on Zoom without wondering if the thing's going to break or not. Do I want to trust artificial intelligence to decide if it's going to be the end of Western civilization or that we're going to launch our nuclear weapons? I don't think so. But if you don't do something about this, that's what's going to happen in the next decade. So things are not good and they're getting worse. So I should point out here that I spent a decade or more working on the ozone hole problem with NASA. It was a big, important problem. We could, at this point in time, actually have severe problems if we hadn't solved that problem. That took thousands of scientists around the world working on that problem to solve it. This nuclear war problem is even more complicated. These are the people that are working on this. This is not thousands of people. This is a small group of people. Where is a scientific group working to solve this problem. Is it buried in the Department of Defense? Probably not. This is an issue that a small number of people that know about this. There is a National Academy of Sciences study being done on this problem at the current time. This may give us a little bit better impression of what is the status of this problem. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing this screen now, and we can talk about this. Oops, I did the wrong thing.
Okay. I guess that everyone is as stunned as I am, given the reality of the situation. But then again, I have to say that it's, for me personally, it's hugely encouraging to understand that somebody like you, Professor Toon, has taken this weight on our behalf for so many years in the context of this potentially cataclysmic issue. And to a certain extent, when we're faced with these kinds of issues, there's a sort of a kind of an idea of what can one do, and sort of to throw one's head up and put one's head in the sand, which is exactly what shouldn't happen. And one of the things that interested me about what you were saying is as it were, the cultural difference between what happened in the 1980s and what's happening now. And you pointed out, for people like you and I, to a certain extent generational, that we remember what it was like when significant nuclear threats were on the horizon. And in that sense, is there a sort of a cultural change now in terms of policy, that policy doesn't quite get really what this is about?
Yeah, I think there's a huge cultural shift from the 1980s in many ways. When I was young, I was born right after the end of the Second World War, and there were nuclear weapons around, and you had to do drills when you were in school, get under your desk to prevent yourself from being killed by a nuclear explosion, which of course was futile. And my mother, by the early 1960s, said, "Oh, you can't drink milk anymore because the nuclear weapons tests are putting so much radiation in the atmosphere that it's getting into children's teeth and bones." And there were demonstrations led by Linus Pauling and other people that put a ban on testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. And so those kinds of memories lead people to worry about this. But at the end of the Soviet Union in 1992 or so, it became very hopeful. Everybody thought, "Oh my, thank God, we're finished with this Cold War, and we're threatening each other all the time with things, and peace is broken out, and we're going to solve our differences by negotiations and talking to each other, and we're going to stop fighting these wars all over the place." And for a while it looked like that was true, and that would be a hopeful spring, so to speak, where we didn't have to keep worrying about this, and the number of weapons did go down and down and down. But for various reasons, now we've reached a turning point where various dictators around the world have decided that they should invade their neighbors, that they should prevent their own citizens from expressing their views. And of course, the average person feels overwhelmed, partly because of the information overflow now. So there's so many problems going on in the world, so many things to think about. When I was young, you couldn't even go to China, unless you had a lot of money and a lot of time and things like that. And now in the news, I hear every time there's a big flood in China. I hear about people getting killed in Africa or something like that. So our expanse of understanding of problems is so much greater now that it seems overwhelming. But there are times when people have to do something about these problems, and this is one of those times.
Okay, I've been remiss in my job as moderator, given the fact that there's no sort of live vis-a-vis interaction. I would ask people to put their questions into the chat, into the Q&A, And that way I can then put these questions to Professor Toon. So to help with the discussion, let's do this. Let's talk it through. Okay, so from Linda Gunther, Linda says, what was your impression of that recent National Academy of Science Committee meeting at which you and Alan Robock spoke? It was full of people representing the labs that make these weapons and the NNSA. This didn't feel encouraging. What do you think that the NAS will do? Will the NAS do anything useful on this?
I think they will do something useful on it. I know several of the people that are on that committee, and they're well-known science people, and even some of them in the weapons labs. In the 1980s, the university, if you want to say, science community and non-military scientists, like in NASA, for example, worked with scientists from the Department of Energy, who were the bomb makers, kind of open conversations. We had meetings, everybody went, they all told everybody what they had learned. There was even money to do research for a short period of time on this problem, which entrained, many tens, perhaps even 100 people in the university community. And so there was a lot of conversation at that time, and actually a lot of some people have written articles in magazines saying, "Oh, this is a birth of climate modeling that came from these nuclear weapons things." And I think there was lots of climate modeling going on other than that, but nevertheless, it did improve climate modeling, and those are very important conversations. But now we've reached a point now where the Department of Energy is silent on this topic. It won't, hasn't been communicating to people. And I hope this Academy study is the beginning of a conversation that will engage. We have to involve the Department of Energy and Department of Defense in these kinds of studies. I mean, those are the people that are going to decide what to do. And, if we don't have these conversations, they're pretty much decide by themselves. And, which is what's happened to nuclear winter. It's kind of like everything else, like tobacco smoking, the ozone hole, global warming. There's a whole group of people that come up with false goods about every one of these things. And they're even the same group of people. Of course, some of them have died over the decades from banning cigarette smoking to being against solving the problem of the ozone hole to global warming and nuclear winter. But, there's opposition to that. And so it's very easy for the people in the Department of Defense to say, oh, that's just a bunch of university people, trying to make problems. And so it's very important that we have conversations about this with the people in the Department of Energy and Defense. And likewise, it's very important that we engage the world science community. When Gorbachev decided to work with Reagan to get rid of the weapons, he said, Russian and American scientists are telling me this is a problem. And partly this is about Carl Sagan. At the time in the early 1980s, Carl was a very famous scientist, and people paid attention to what he had to say. I worked for NASA at the time, and we tried to give a talk about this. When NASA shut us down, said you can talk about it, and said you have to have it reviewed. Well, this was a political mistake on their part, because Carl said, "Oh, okay, let's have a review." And so if it had been me, I'd have said, "Okay, well, let's have 5 people come and talk about it." I said, "No." Carl invited people from all over the world to come to Boston. More than 100 people to come to Boston from Russia and Britain and everybody else who had a stake in this, and debate about whether what we were saying made sense. And of course, that encouraged them to go back to their countries and have their scientists talk about it. You're not going to get anywhere in the world with me, an American, telling somebody in Iran about nuclear weapons. Somebody in Iran has to tell the leaders of Iran about that. So we need a large number of people around the world to get involved in studying this problem.
Just one from me. Do you think that China fully understands that if there were even to be a strategic exchange between Russia and the US, that China would starve? And hence, what might that imply?
Well, this is an interesting kind of question. There's plenty of intelligent people in China. You know, there's a huge scientific community there. In fact, they're dominating publications now, not just in sheer number, but in quality of publications in the world in science problems. So I have no doubt that the people in China, some of whom are my former graduate students, know about this kind of issue. But, you know, the question then is whether they can actually talk to their political leaders about it. You know, this is an issue here that even in the United States, we have politicians. You know, this happened yesterday where politicians in Tennessee got rid of a bunch of politicians that were talking about gun control. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me where somehow the political system is so charged that you can't even have a debate or the opposition from the government. I mean, you know, and that's the kind of thing that's going on in places like China and Russia, where the government is suppressing the press and they're suppressing their own people. So there's a lack of communication there. That's very dangerous.
This is from Ace Hoffman. If Zaporizhia, all 6 reactors, is destroyed with a nuclear weapon, what would the consequences be?
Okay, well, this is a very complex question in many ways. So radiation in a nuclear war has a couple of different facets to it. So there are some places, for example, you know, those missiles are buried under the ground in concrete silos, and they would be attacked by what are called a ground burst, where the explosion occurs right at the ground and makes a big crater in the ground, which could be, you know, a couple of football fields.
Professor Toon, at a certain point, your audio is not working very well.
Deep.
Professor Toon, your audio goes in and out a little bit now.
Those missiles.
How do we get that?
Well, if you do that, the radiation released in the bomb attaches itself to the dirt.
Okay, whilst Professor Toon is battling with audio, and one wonders why all of a sudden his audio has gone a bit awry.
I thought the same thing.
Yeah, do you think his audio is back, or should I sort of fill in, as it were?
Well, you can fill in, and then perhaps I'll have someone in the office see if they can call him, so we'll have him on audio.
Okay, I'll try to do that, but clearly he's absolutely the expert.
But it is odd, Dr. Dorfman. It's odd that just when he starts talking about the specifics.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is odd. Actually.
We'll try and bring him on the phone.
Yes, it is odd, actually. Yes, it is odd. So in terms of what struck me by Professor Toon's discussion is that one understands that, if exchanges really get hot, it's a horrendous situation. But the argument is that, oh yes, we've already had the nuclear cataclysm during the weapons test, when there had been a huge amount of bombs set off, and we haven't seen nuclear winter. But actually what Professor Toon tells us is that these weapons were set off in desert or island locations where you don't see the burn, where you don't see the atmospheric dispersion burn that you would see if there was a strategic nuclear exchange. So there's a key distinction between what happened in the, during the weapons testing era, when a significant amount of weapons were set off, and the very real risk of a nuclear winter. In other words, I'm sorry to say, but it's mass starvation post a strategic nuclear exchange. Also, the other issue that Professor Toon really discussed was a kind of a cultural one, which is also really, really very interesting, because science risk is both a kind of it's both a cultural and a scientific phenomenon. Both of these things work in tandem. And what we saw in the 1980s was that there was a percolation into into policy that, yes, we all, basically, yes, we were all facing this, let's face it, this form of Armageddon that unfortunately that we're seeing less and less now. So the issue seems to be the percolation of the science to policy. And the question is how that can be achieved, whether that's through the media or whether that's through direct meetings or otherwise. And so this is something that it seemed to be incredibly important to kind of emphasize. I'm just wondering how far we've got with Professor Toon.
Let me retrieve my phone here. Is he online?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, I'm sorry, I don't know what the problem is here.
Coincidental, but just when you started describing how the craters around the targets will happen, you disappeared off face, and then Dr. Dorfman just spoke about how the importance of what you're saying needs to be shared with government and policy officials, etc. Do you want to maybe speak to the specifics of the sequence of events that would happen in an exchange that you were?
Sure. Let's just return to the question that was asked about radioactivity. So there is a danger from ground bursts, which is important. But then most of the weapons that would be used to attack cities are what are called air bursts. And so a lot of the radiation then goes into the atmosphere. And so this is an important thing to know in case you're ever near a nuclear weapons attack. The radiation decays very, very rapidly. So if the radiation within 3 days goes down to a few percent of what it was originally, which is why you want to stay in your house and not go out if you're anywhere near an explosion like that. And so we think that most of the radiation would just blow away into the atmosphere. But the big danger here really is attacking nuclear weapons or attacking nuclear reactors. The amount of radiation in a nuclear reactor core and then the waste around the nuclear reactor is very large. It can be comparable to what's in all of the nuclear weapons. So you don't want to have a nuclear reactor fail or be blown up. That would produce a huge amount of radiation.
Okay, there's a question from an anonymous attendee. Professor Toon, what kind of reasoning do you think would lead policymakers in DoD, Congress, DOE, and elsewhere to reopen the debate on the effects of nuclear war?
Well, I think that in the 1980s, Congress people, were worried about this. And they were pressing the Department of Defense to respond. But, at the moment, politicians are not concerned with this problem. They're paying very little attention to it. I think that's because they don't see their constituents being concerned about it. So I think that to solve this problem, we really need people to show politicians that they're worried about a nuclear conflict, and the government in the United States is spending somewhere between $300 billion and $1 trillion
to upgrade the nuclear arsenal. Is that where you want your tax money to go? Is building up more nuclear weapons? Or would you rather spend it on healthcare and education and things like that? So these are important political issues. And in the United States, at least, I think it has to come from the ground up.
Well, let me interrupt here for a second, Professor. And the one reason that we're so grateful to have you and Dr. Dorfman on this call today is because we have San Onofre nuclear waste piled on the beach 100 feet from the ocean, rising seas. But we haven't really yet, until this call and your magnificent diagrams, seen how much of a target. I'm looking at the military targets in San Diego with 100 kiloton weapons. It just strikes me as something that has yet to be considered until the recent Ukraine events with Putin. And it just strikes me as more important is the vast 3.5 million pounds of nuclear waste sitting as a target. I had no idea that the nuclear waste storage and the nuclear power plants are a magnificent target for an enemy. Is there any way you can speak to that?
Sure. Well, this is a complicated issue. It's against the laws of war to attack a dam, for example, because if you break the dam, it will flood everybody downstream and it will cut off their power. It's also not legal to attack nuclear power plants. However, in the laws of war, there is an exception, which says if the military is using that power or making use of something about the facility, then you can attack it. So it's unclear about the rules of war. And of course, it's also unclear whether any combatant in a nuclear war would care about the rules of war. We have to think nuclear war is going to be nothing like the wars we're familiar with. Like the Second World War went on for something like 7 years. People were able to change strategies and develop new weapons and build up industries, all those sorts of things because of that time. A nuclear war is going to be over probably in a week. You launch all the weapons you have, and there's going to be nobody left on the other end, to do very much. So it will be a very sudden attack, which makes it more uncertain as to how will the attack be conducted. What targets will be used and things like that. But the problem with these nuclear reactors, of course, is that some of them are close to cities or in cities. So they might, even if they weren't attacked directly, they might be attacked by accident. They might be in the footprint of the explosion. But also, we already can see from the experience at Fukushima that the nuclear power plants need to have external power to keep their generators running if they shut down their cores. And there's not going to be a bunch of generators running to support these nuclear power plants in a nuclear war. So even if they're not directly attacked, they may very well melt down in the same way it happened in Chernobyl and Fukushima because they lose power. And, so that is a serious threat. And it's one that, as far as I know of, several people have suggested it's a problem, but I haven't seen very many analyses of what the real scope of the problem is.
And there's a follow-up to that question from Gordon Edwards, our friends in Canada. My understanding is that if a nuclear weapon were to vaporize a nuclear reactor, including the spent fuel pool, that the amount of radioactive fallout would be increased by a factor of several thousand. Is this your understanding as well?
Yes, I think that there is a very large amount of radiation in these reactors, and it's a lot more than there is in a modest number of nuclear weapons. I don't recall right this minute exactly what the factor is, but you start blowing up a bunch of nuclear reactors and you're almost certainly going to release a lot of radiation, and much more than in the bombs.
Yes.
You can ask, that Russia is not likely to attack nuclear reactors in Europe because it would probably blow the radiation down on Russia. The United States might attack reactors in Russia, but certainly, Russia might consider attacking reactors in the United States because this stuff would be far away from them. But who knows we don't know what the targeting plans for any of these countries are. But yeah, the opening reactors is an important problem. That is an example of something that we don't know if the military has ever even thought about this. Very few people, there are a couple of papers out there about what would happen, but I don't think anybody has given it very much consideration. So it's an open issue.
I mean, there's just a number of questions about health effects on the plumes of radiation. One here from Norma Field, asking for clarification regarding the photo of Hiroshima and the Pyrocumulus cloud. You said that once a cloud reaches the stratosphere, it doesn't rain out. And the Hiroshima and Nagasaki clouds did produce what's called black rain in Japan, with important and contested by the government and scientists of the health effects. In the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, did the highest level of the clouds linger on in the stratosphere while the lower strata rained out?
Well, we don't know very much about that. It was in the middle of a war, and people had very little understanding of these problems. We do know a lot about pyrocumulus now because we've seen a number of them develop over large forest fires. So, for example, there's been a prediction of nuclear winter that if smoke got near the tropopause, which is around 16 kilometers in the tropics and 12 kilometers in mid-latitudes, if smoke got to those altitudes, that heating by the sun would drive it into the stratosphere to high levels. And so we predicted this in the 1980s, and finally in 2017, there was a big enough fire in Canada that smoke actually did get to the tropopause, and then it floated upward to about 20 kilometers. And this is a very small amount of smoke compared to what was a nuclear war. And again in 2020, we saw the same thing happen from the big fires in Australia in the December, January timeframe around 2020. And those fires likewise put a huge amount of smoke into the stratosphere, which could be seen by satellites for more than a year. And it rose to high levels just as was predicted. Pyrocumulus don't rain very much, but they do rain. And, there was a black rain at Hiroshima. And so some of the smoke from Hiroshima did rain out on the city of Hiroshima. So in our models, we assume about 20% of the smoke will be rained out in the troposphere near wherever the fire was, where the city was. But this is something that we don't know much about. And there are a couple of people on the National Academy panel who know about pyrocumulus clouds and are studying them with advanced models. And I should say the same thing is true in fires in general, is that people know a lot about forest fires. There are huge numbers of people in Boulder, where I live, for example, that know and NCAR studying forest fires and how they're spreading and how they're blowing in the wind because they want to protect firefighters and also tell the firefighters where to fight the fire and how to run if the fire is coming toward them. But we know almost nothing about urban fires. There are no models that are capable of predicting how a city will burn. We just had this happen in Boulder. We had a fire, 100-mile-an-hour winds in the December timeframe. It blew a fire across a city here in Boulder and burned 1,000 houses in a day. And we know nothing about how that spread. So there's a lot of issues about urban fires and how high their smoke gets and how much of it rains out. These are all important issues that need work.
Mm. Can I say that for me personally, I find it hugely, I know it sounds paradoxical, but I find it hugely encouraging that someone like you has devoted significant work to, as it were, holding this key issue, which is hugely worrying, hugely traumatic. And in that sense, there's a sort of a debt that we owe you for this. Also, for others hearing about this, perhaps for the first time, there's probably a sense of, if not revulsion, then deep concern and deep worry, which of course is true, is relevant, because this is the reality. This is absolutely the way things are. And I was just wondering, and I'm terribly sorry about this, but at a personal level, you've engaged with this on a deep scientific level. I was just wondering how you've done this.
Well, this is not the only thing I do.
Yes, of course,
A lot of work on planetary exploration and all kinds of other issues.
Yeah.
Right now, I've got students working on building climate model charts and things like that. So it's not the only thing I do, but nevertheless, it is very difficult to work on this problem. You know, and the reason that I and the other people I showed pictures of, like Alan Roebuck, have been working on it is because it's an important problem and it's being ignored.
Yes.
You know, why do universities keep a bunch of faculty around? Why do they pay them? You know, and I get paid 40% of my time to do research, and the university lets me do research whatever I want. And but you know, the taxpayers of Colorado who pay my salary want something there. You know, they just want me wasting my time and their money. You know, they want me to solve their problems and tell them when there's an important issue and try to prevent something bad from happening to them. So that's one of the roles of people who do research that are supported by the public. And, you know, so I feel an obligation. You know, I didn't expect to work on this problem. I was working on the dinosaur extinction problem, which led us to think about the parallels between it and a nuclear war. You know, the dinosaurs went extinct, and you know, they went extinct for a lot of the same physical reasons that would physical phenomena that would occur in a nuclear war, namely all this smoke. We know that everything on the surface of the earth burned at the time of the extinction of the dinosaurs, and the smoke then helped cause a lot of the extinctions. So you see a parallel like that, you think, well, I better do something about this. So I wouldn't say it's a fun project to work on. It's very depressing and frustrating to see people ignoring it. And, you know, I actually, you know, it used to be 5 years ago, if I tried to talk about nuclear weapons, no one would come to hear my talk. So I would talk about the death of the dinosaurs and the parallels with nuclear weapons. And people would come to hear about the death of the dinosaurs. So it's interesting, you know, you give a talk about the dinosaurs, the audience is very engaged, they're interested, they're talking to each other, they're laughing about things. You switch to nuclear wars, the audience goes silent because it's them, you know, that might be affected. So it's, you know, I think it's come back because of Putin as an issue. And, you know, it's something we have to deal with in the near future. Hopefully there won't be a nuclear war. I don't think there will be a nuclear war over Ukraine. I think that's just a bluff, and people shouldn't become too worried about this. You know, you have to maintain some level of calm and realize that things are often not what they seem. But nevertheless, this is a problem we have to deal with. And when the war in Ukraine is over, we have to have treaties back in place to control this problem.
Professor, let me interrupt for 1 second, Dr. Dorfman. I'm getting a lot of people texting me about the nuclear waste because in San Diego, we have some 9 million people within 50 miles of a nuclear waste storage dump site. And that's of concern as a target or just yeah. So what can you, and I happen to have a background in community environmental health. So that makes me more worried about the effects of radiation. And I had not known before you that as a target, nuclear waste site or a nuclear power plant is considerably more dangerous than atom bombs blowing up in the air. I guess what's my question? Help me out, Professor.
Well, you obviously don't want the local power plant to fail. And, nuclear power in the United States has a long history of being extremely risk-free. There have been very few incidents of much concern. So it's generally very safe. But, you can't, guarantee safety forever. The power plant there in San Diego, as I understand it, I've driven by it before, is right in the coastline. It's not unlike Fukushima in terms of location. I have no idea, how well it's protected against a big tidal wave. Seems to me like up on a cliff. So probably people certainly know in California that there are earthquakes. And so I assume that they would be protected from that. But I don't know that much about that power plant, and this is not a field in which I'm an expert. So all I can tell you is for sure there's a lot of radiation in there, in the waste and in the core. You don't want that to break open and be distributed. And we really have to solve this problem of where to store nuclear waste. It's not only a hazard from being broken open, it's a terrorist hazard. You could have somebody get in there and steal some of this nuclear waste and spread it around somewhere, which probably wouldn't actually be that dangerous, but it would almost certainly create panic in the city. So that's another aspect of this, is just terrorists getting access to all this stored nuclear waste, and stored all over the world in pretty much the same way. It's around the power plants or connected to them in some way. So this is a widespread unsolved problem in nuclear power, which is another problem that society needs to solve. It can't just keep going this way. It needs to solve the problem of getting rid of this waste.
Dr. Dorfman, how does the production of nuclear power relate to nuclear weapons production? If you want to speak to that, we may as well.
Okay. My colleagues at Sussex University at SPRU Science Policy Research Unit, Professor Andy Sterling and Dr. Phil Johnston, have made a clear argument that they go hand in hand on both a practical and sort of economic level. To a certain extent, it's very difficult to have one without the other, because in terms of R&D, research and development budgets, and also the development of the capacity in terms of the intellectual capacity and the manufacturing capacity, these two things sort of go hand in hand. Macron also has used this as a sort of significant plus from his perspective. Now, I personally, I don't believe in unilateral disarmament. I believe in multilateral disarmament. That is my position. However, it has to be said that if you were to put to one side the nuclear armaments budget from the civil nuclear budget, then we could all see exactly how much this cost. And of course, the cost is truly astronomical. I remember back in the day, my PhD was on the health effects of a nuclear plant in the UK. That's Aldermaston, Greenham Common, and to a certain extent Harwell. And what occurred to me then was that it's a sort of a kind of a mad self-harming almost, that what you're doing is that you're putting right near to your centres of population, this is in Reading, which is right next to London, facilities that combine explosives with nuclear radiation. And so therefore you're creating a target and an exposed population. So it's an incredibly complex issue that has no real answers, no real solutions, but it has to be said that we're all, to a certain extent, really feeling these risks one way or another.
My question to each of you, what do you do to keep life light? Let me start with you, Dr. Dorfman.
Okay. I mean, we've been around the block. The point about life is it's not all about pleasure. There are certain things that are important, but engaging with these important things allows one to, in one's life, keep things light. There seems to be something important about trying to, as it were, help. Now, if one does this, there are honestly and truly very real paybacks, and one feels this very clearly in one's personal life.
Professor, may I ask you the same question?
I'm not sure what the question was. I couldn't quite hear it.
Well, how you keep life, how you keep your life with joy, and I mean, so much that's so gloomy and imminent. So how do you, and what would Carl Sagan have said?
Well, Carl was very worried about this because he this is a famous question among astronomers, which was basically the question is, where are they? There's so many civilizations that should be out there in our galaxy. I mean, the nearest planet that's inhabited could be only a few light years from us. Why aren't they communicating with us? Why aren't we detecting them? This is a big issue of why that's not happening. And Carl used what's called the Drake equation to calculate the number of civilizations in the galaxy. And he concluded that civilizations must destroy themselves within a few decades of inventing nuclear weapons. He thought 50 years was about the destruction time, which we've passed. So yeah, he was quite concerned about that from the astronomical point of view of the development of nuclear weapons and losing control of them. And I mean, it's hard to imagine that the world in 100 years from now is going to be having all these little countries having wars with each other and dictators popping up all over the place. You just can't have an advanced civilization that's allowing itself to be so destructive. So I'm optimistic about the future that we will solve these problems. And, when I was a kid, I got, interested in all kinds of the problems and discoveries in the world. Like, some of these are dumb, like, are there Yetis? When I was a kid, magazines had articles about the existence of Yetis because people were wandering around the Himalayas, thought they had found evidence of giant ape people. And, it turned out this was something that some monks were making money on by selling monkey skulls together. But, that thing still persists, and, people think, oh, there's Bigfoot around somewhere. And this is kind of a joke thing, but, there are real television shows telling children that Bigfoot exists. I know a famous one, I'm getting off the track here, but I'll come back to my point. There's a famous one, there was a Black Panther on a TV show wandering around the US, supposedly. And someone had a movie of this Black Panther, and yeah, it sure looked like a big black cat wandering around somebody's yard. And so they called in some photographer. He said, no, this is just a house cat that's black. And because of the way the picture's taken, it makes it look like it's a mountain lion. And you would think that would end the subject, and that this TV program for children would say, oh, we solved the problem scientifically. We know the answer is it's a house cat. No, they go right back to, oh, maybe it's a Black Panther. You know, this is very bad for society to have these kinds of TV shows. But at any rate, when I was a kid, there were all kinds of things. The Yetis got answered to me when I was about 10 years old. They don't exist. You know, lots of other problems, you know, like what caused the ice ages? When did life arise? Is there life on Mars? How did the dinosaurs die? So I had kind of a list of these as a kid, and I've been working on all of them ever since then. And so that's very engaging, and I enjoy working on understanding nature and trying to understand the answers to these problems, and they're not all answered by any means. And then, of course, I have children of my own and a family, and so I have a lot of pride in my children and happiness with my family, and I enjoy being at a university and teaching students and seeing my students grow up and become scientists themselves. So all that is very rewarding. And, you know, I'm optimistic about the future, and studying this nuclear problem does not make me worry about it. It makes me want to do something about it. We have to do something about it, not worry about it.
And can I add also that in terms of nuclear, when one really considers the facts here, something like 84% of all new power worldwide last year put down in terms of power capacity globally was renewables. There is no question but the renewable evolution is here. It's not an issue that one needs to discuss. It's like climate. The International Energy Agency says the same thing. The International Panel on Climate Change says that renewables are 10 times better at climate mitigation than nuclear. So the debate is over. The renewable evolution is here, and it will change all our lives. And it will change our lives in a practical and also in an emotional sense, insofar as that when we know that we can switch on that light or go on that voyage on a train, we know that the power that we use will be sustainable. And in that sense, there is also great hope within that, in the context of all of the kinds of things that we've been discussing, which is potential cataclysm and all of the worries that surround us all. Within all of this, there is very real reason to hope. And that's not a sort of that's not a kind of a rosy-toed view. This is a pragmatic view from the information that we now have.
Yeah. This has been absolutely brilliant. I want to thank Dr. Dorfman and Professor Toon for their exquisite enlightenment to us and the audience. Their expertise is invaluable. We're fortunate to be having the best people to share their knowledge. I hope this conversation has provided everyone in the audience a better understanding of potential dangers of a nuclear winter, the need for continued research and the advocacy efforts on everyone on the call to keep us safe. I encourage you to stay in touch with the Samuel Lawrence Foundation by following up with the transcript will be provided shortly, as well as the video. Subscribe to our newsletter, stay up to date on our work, tune in for additional talks. Here we advocate for environmental and social justice through spreading awareness and knowledge to progressive organizations and projects in need of support. Thank you very much, Professor Toon and Dr. Dorfman, and all the people behind the scenes, including Pilioha, Madeline, Jill, and everyone else who made this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.